Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating dynamic playing out in modern politics. We are analyzing the profound disconnect between a major political party's cultural strategies and the urgent, very real economic realities facing today's voters. Think about it. When a fringe or populist party starts gaining serious ground, how exactly does the establishment respond? And, maybe more importantly, what happens when that response completely misses the mark on what the electorate actually cares about? Well, we are going to unpack a specific case study today that perfectly highlights this tension.
Here is our agenda for mapping out this political gap. We'll start with 1, the populist surge, move into 2, the cultural strategy, examine 3, the internal disconnect, ground ourselves in 4, the cost of living reality, break down 5, the anatomy of voter grievance, and evaluate 6, the strategic miscalculation.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the populist surge, catalyst for change. So, how do you actually counter a populist surge? This is the exact dilemma facing the Labour Party in Australia right now, especially as support for populist groups, specifically One Nation, really starts to grow in the polls. When you see 30% of voters looking outside the major parties, it absolutely rings alarm bells at headquarters. It prompts a swift, almost immediate internal response. But the big question for political analysts isn't just that a major party responds, it's how they respond. Do they address the actual root cause of the surge, or do they just react to what their most vocal internal supporters are demanding? Which brings us to Section 2, the cultural strategy, drafted responses. Think about the contrast here between the proposed solutions and the actual problems. On one hand, we have the party's drafted response to One Nation's rise, which is a purely cultural focus. A senior party source stated that they're committing to an anti-racism strategy and formalizing support for welcome to country ceremonies. This is directly responding to concerns about racism from their branch members. But compare that to the stark economic reality. Analysts point out a massive gap here. The public is literally drowning in a cost of living crisis, soaring inflation, and high interest rates. So critics are asking a very practical question. How exactly does a conference motion on a cultural ceremony make a family's groceries any cheaper or their mortgage interest rates any lower? The hard answer, analysts argue, is that it just doesn't. So where does this focus even come from? Let's look at Section 3, the internal disconnect, branch versus public. This quote from former Labour MP Michael Danby really hits the nail on the head regarding the structural problem inside major political organisations. He argues that an iron rule of any government should be to never listen to branch members. Now, why would he say that? Well, because party delegates, the highly engaged activists who actually attend conferences and draft platforms, are largely insulated from the average voter. They are, as Danby notes, far to the left of the general public. So while delegates are zeroing in on cultural motions and domestic culture wars, the average voter out in regional areas like Manningatong or across Western Australia is dealing with entirely different, much more pragmatic issues. This internal disconnect is a real game changer because it leads to policies that satisfy the party base but completely alienate the general electorate. Let's move to Section 4, the cost of living reality, what voters care about. Public relations experts and political commentators are practically shouting this from the rooftops right now. It is all about the cost of living. We're talking about skyrocketing grocery bills that hit families literally every single week. We're talking about high mortgage interest rates that are just eating away at household incomes. And of course, rising electricity prices, which are compounded by the heavy capital sunk costs of massive energy transitions, like building new transmission lines for green hydrogen. When a voter is sitting at their kitchen table trying to balance these staggering real-world costs, a political party emphasizing a domestic cultural agenda appears, frankly, completely out of touch. These are severe financial burdens, and cultural platform amendments do absolutely nothing to alleviate them. And we need to be clear, this isn't just a fringe issue. This represents a massive chunk of the population. Commentators warned it's a huge mistake to dismiss or dump on the more than 30% of Australian voters who are currently looking outside the major political parties for some kind of relief. Interestingly, analysts point out a real double standard here. Often, center-right parties are warned by pundits not to drift too far to the right to chase fringe votes. Yet observers note that Labour seems to be making the exact same mistake in the other direction. They're drifting too far left to satisfy their base, while completely ignoring the very real economic pain that's driving this 30% away from the center in the first place. Which naturally leads us to Section 5, the anatomy of voter grievance, economic pessimism. We hear the term grievance politics thrown around a lot in the media, but experts define it very specifically in this context. It's a deep, structural frustration rooted in a really painful recognition, the belief that your children are simply not going to do as well financially as you did. It's the feeling that the major parties have completely failed to help people get ahead, and that this economic prosperity politicians constantly brag about, yeah, it's not being shared with the working class. Experts argue that this profound economic pessimism is the true engine behind the rising support for populist movements. It's an anxiety about the future, driven entirely by dollars and cents, not by domestic culture wars.
Finally, let's examine Section 6, the strategic miscalculation, missing the target.
Here is the absolute core of the political disconnect. On one side, we have labor's target, fighting domestic culture wars via internal party conferences to satisfy left-wing delegates. But on the other side, we have what actually drives the populist voter: economic anxiety, high international immigration rates impacting local infrastructure, and a total lack of shared economic prosperity. Observers note that the party is totally conflating these issues. If a voter is leaning toward a populist group like One Nation, they are typically locked in on issues like international immigration and the economy. Actually, let me put it this way. They aren't going to be swayed away from a populist vote just because a major party passed a cultural motion at a conference. By targeting the domestic cultural issues, the major party is completely missing the underlying motivations of the economically alienated voter.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the bottom line. The Prime Minister himself has been known to repeat variations of the famous James Carville mantra, "It's the economy, stupid." And yet, the party's current strategy seems to ignore that very advice. So we're left with a critical question. When voters finally head to the ballot box and check their wallets, will they care about a cultural platform drafted by insulated party delegates, or will they vote based on the price of their groceries and the cost of their mortgage? History tells us that in a cost of living crisis, economic reality almost always crushes cultural strategy. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the strategies you see in the headlines, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.